Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books, and I am most glad to be joined today by an old friend and author, James Martin, Jesuit priest, editor-at-large at America Magazine, and a best-selling author. And honestly, I'd be very surprised if anyone watching this is unfamiliar with Father Martin, who is one of the best-known priests and commentators on all things Catholic in the United States and, for all I know, in the universe. You may have read one of his best-selling books, including My Life with the Saints, Learning to Pray, The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, or his most recent bestseller, Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle, which is about the raising of Lazarus. You may know, as I only just learned, that he has received 22 honorary doctorates, which actually seems like more than any individual really needs. But I dare say you are not familiar, most of you, with his very first book, which I'm proud to say Orbis published 25 years ago, This Our Exile, A Spiritual Journey with the Refugees of East Africa. And if you've not read this book, you're really in for a treat. This Our Exile is simply one of the best books that most beautifully written page-turning books that I've ever published. It's impossible to read this book, I think, without tears and laughter and without learning something new about faith, love, and being human. I am so glad that this anniversary gives us an opportunity to talk about your book. Jim, maybe you could begin by telling us about the circumstances that brought you to East Africa and the writing of this story.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on, and thanks for publishing the book 25 years ago. People with long memories will remember this was the original cover of the original book, and then we had a 20th anniversary edition, which you did a beautiful job on. Both editions are beautiful. They have pictures in them, which was, I think, really important. Yeah, so as part of my Jesuit formation, aka training, I was missioned to East Africa, to Nairobi, Kenya, to work with the Jesuit refugee service there. And after a couple of false starts, I ended up working with what were called the income generating projects, which was basically helping refugees from all over East Africa start small businesses and support themselves and their families. And for those people who weren't familiar with the geography, I wasn't certainly, Kenya is surrounded by countries that in the 90s were really having some problems. So Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, further afield, places like Burundi. And we would get refugees who had come from those countries, settled in the refugee camps that ring the border of Kenya, and then come into Nairobi. They were called urban refugees. And what we would do would be to give them grants to help them start small businesses. I have one on my wall, actually. One of the guys I still remember, his name was Didas Kamagunga. And he, for example, made beautiful paintings. This is called Our Lady of the Refugees that we sold. And then we ended up starting a shop called the Mikono Center, which means hands in Swahili. And so the book is about my experience with the refugees and just telling the story of my time there and what I learned, and also telling a lot of their stories as well. And so the book really came after I just thought these stories are incredible. I have to tell these stories, and they're very moving and very powerful for me. And I wanted to just share the stories of individuals, because I think people see refugees and they just think of them as kind of this faceless mass of people, but these are people with stories. So that's where the book came from.
Yeah, that was a point that comes through really clearly because, first of all, they come from different countries. They're not all refugees are just from some refugee place. I mean, you've got Ethiopians and people from Rwanda, including people who are fleeing genocide there, and Uganda, and civil wars, and Somalia. Even a guy comes from Liberia, and they really come to life as individuals. And you also have this feeling like refugees, well, they must be just used to poverty and having nothing. And you meet people who had homes and families and jobs in some place and had to leave everything and find themselves in a foreign country, completely dependent on a system and whatever kind of help they can get. And that was the kind of, someone said, after 2 years here, Brother Jim, everybody in the slums in Nairobi is going to know who you are. And they all seem to come to you.
Well, and it was something, Robert. The very first refugee that I met, kind of officially, I was working in an office at the UN, which sounds a little strange, but Jesuit Refugee Service was helping the UN, and we were doing intakes. This is before I helped to start the small business group. And the very first refugee I met was a fellow, I tell the story in the book, who was from Somalia. And I assumed, he's whatever, he's a nomad, or, we have these images of refugees kind of just subsistence living off the earth or whatever. And I asked him in Swahili, I studied a little Swahili, but not a lot, what language he would be comfortable in. And he said in English, well, I'd be comfortable in English or Swahili or French or German or Latin or Italian, as I recall. He was a professor of philosophy at the University of Mogadishu in Somalia. And it was a good first person to meet because it reminded me, as you said, that, these people have houses and stories and families and, the same way the reader would. And so it's trying to put a story and a face to a lot of those people.
Well, you really give a sense too of their vulnerability and uh, kind of living from day to day with so much uncertainty, where an opportunity to earn some money or to sell something could mean, the difference between food for their families. There's not, a welfare system or social security, even to go to the doctor, or even to get on a bus. That those little bit of money is, as I kept always saying to you, and the difficulties that puts you in too, with your sense of, on the one hand, kind of friendship and solidarity, but this inevitable imbalance in power, where you realize that the decisions that you make or the opportunities that you provide have such deep consequences for someone.
Yeah, I really struggled with that. And I was much younger, of course, at the time. I was in my early 30s, I guess. And I was very conscious of the power differential. I was very conscious of the fact that I'm this, white man coming, into East Africa, knowing almost nothing about it. And I needed to balance that with the mission to work with these people, to work with people who became friends of mine. And also to say, look, well, I do have money, right? We were able to give them grants, and I do have that, and to not shy away from helping them, right? Because I think the other extreme is to say, well, I shouldn't enter into their lives at all because I'm white or because I'm American or because I'm part of a colonial power.
Mhm.
But I had something good that I wanted to give them, which was grants and support and business acumen that I had from going to Wharton and working at GE before. And then eventually we started this shop, which really helped them even more because we brought in all sorts of people to buy their wares. And, I just say, look, I have contacts in embassies and with expats and whatnot, and they were very grateful for them.
Mhm.
So it was always kind of reflecting on, am I being colonialist? Am I being kind of the great white savior, for these people? Or am I being their friend, really, and
Yeah.
trying to help them? So it was a
Mhm.
balance, and I hope I struck it. And I talked about some of the struggles of that in the book as well.
Well, it's very moving, the work you did in providing this opportunity for them to sell crafts, and you almost have the feeling like, gosh, are these people have just, or do they have all these talents, or whether it was weaving or making baskets or carving, amazing sculptures or something like that. And there's like one guy who comes, you're dealing with at one point, and the sadness is that there's like nothing he can really do
Yeah,
and nothing he can create or make.
yeah.
And
I'll never forget that. It was a guy, I think the one you're talking to was a guy named John Mudaburunga, and he was a cattle farmer. That was his skill, right? A lot of the skills were not marketable, not they weren't all making handicrafts. And this guy was a cattle farmer. That's what he did. So we gave him a grant to buy cows, I think a cow or two cows. And he asked me to come to his shamba, his farm, to visit and to see what was going on with the cows. And Kenya was in the middle of a drought. And so the cows, I didn't realize this, but cows need to eat grass so they can produce milk, and they need to have moisture, right? They need to have a lot of water to produce milk. And because there was a drought, they couldn't produce milk. And so his livelihood was done. And he said, well, now I have to sell the cows, which were the things that we had given him the grant for. And I'll never forget it. I talk about in the book. He said, what do I do now? And I said, I don't know. And one of the points of the story was I think that we tend to think that refugees or migrants are somehow lazy. These were the hardest working people that I'd ever met. I mean, truly, right? And they're away from their countries, their families sometimes, and they really, really, really worked hard. And this guy, one of the reasons I wanted to tell the story was that this guy did everything right. He got a grant. He got a grant for something that he knew how to do. He bought the cattle. He took care of them, and it still didn't work because of, forces outside his control. And so I really wanted to show the reader that, that these people, and it's very contemporary, who people think are lazy or whatever, or too dependent on public handouts, are really hardworking, right?
Mm.
And they did the exact same things that you and I would do, and still came up short often. So it was difficult to see.
This guy was actually walking 3 hours a day to carry water to his
Yeah.
cattle. Wow.
Yeah. No, and I remember standing with him in the blazing sun, and he said, "What can I do now?" And I didn't have an answer for him. So it was also a situation of, looking at our own powerlessness sometimes in
Mhm.
in these situations. For the most part, though, the refugees I talk about were quite successful, and some of them very successful in turning things around and running these businesses. It's funny you should say that, Robert, about these skills. Different countries sort of seem to produce people with different skills. So the Ethiopians knew how to do paintings and fabrics. The Rwandese knew how to make baskets, and so did the Ugandans. And so I think because they came from, I would say like simpler backgrounds in terms of not
Mhm.
having a lot of sort of extraneous things, they were often forced, to make things on their own. So they knew how to sew, they know how to make baskets, and we were able to put those skills to good use. The other thing I really liked about the Mikono Center was that we were able to sort of lift up their cultures.
Mhm. Yeah.
So it wasn't just they were getting paid for these wares, right? Like these baskets and whatnot, but that we were showcasing the cultural stuff, the cultural sort of legacies that they brought with them, which I was really proud of too.
The story where you have this recognize this opportunity for a product, which would be stoles for foreign priests, and they would like something kind of African looking, and they were trying to understand what exactly you had in mind. They were just copying, Western style stoles that you would show them, and you finally had to persuade them, no, 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 something more African looking, whatever that means.
Oh, and it was a funny thing. I was actually talking to an African Jesuit about this last night in my community, or 2 nights ago. That here I was telling them, what to do rather than, because I knew what would sell. And
Mhm.
I think they had been told that this sort of Western style is what Western priests want. So they were, obviously, trying
Mhm.
to satisfy the market. But when I said you can use African cloth, they were delighted, and it was a lot easier. They used to call them, which I thought was kind of funny. Some of them would call them the scarves. They were the
Yes.
stoles. We'll make more scarves, and they were super easy to make. It's just, if you think about it, it was just kind of an L-shaped piece of fabric, and we sold tons of them. So that's the thing. I mean, I think the balance between knowing that, I had some advice that I thought was helpful, and also allowing them, their own agency. That's the balance there.
Mhm. Well, who
Uh,
would have known that
it was
your
hard.
Wharton training
Yes, right.
would be used in this way?
That's right.
The A lot of the the stories of the refugees are so beautiful and often very funny, and very touching, and that of course there are lots of stories about your travels and places you go, and I kept really being impatient. Let's get back to the refugees, because every time we met one of these people, and their kind of beautiful way of speaking, and their kind of courtesy, and their their own dignity that they brought. They were not servile,
Absolutely.
and but it's but the book is really a lot about how this changed you and your own heart opening up through these relationships.
Yeah, and I think what it did to me was really broke open my heart. It really challenged me, and it brought me into contact with a group of people. I got to know, they were friends after two
Mhm.
years, who really were very faithful and hopeful, and above all, hardworking. And they did not let things, get them down. Their houses would be burned down, or like a child would die or a sister would die, and they were they would just push ahead. Tuna endelea was the Swahili. We are moving on. Tuna endelea, pole, pole, slowly, slowly.
Hmm.
And I found that very moving. They were also, as you allude to, a lot of them were quite funny,
Hmm.
and had funny stories and funny like quips, and would, tease me, which I really appreciated. The story you told earlier, I there was a woman that announced that her child was going to be named James Martin.
Yeah.
9 months later, she brings me James Martin Nakiobe. And then she says, we need clothes for baptism, and we want to have a party too. So I gave her out of my pocket my own money for baptismal clothes, and we had a party at our Jesuit community. And then another woman said that she was going to name her child James Martin.
Yes.
And she also said she needed money for baptismal clothes. And this woman, Alice Nabwire, who was Ugandan, came in and said, if you keep doing this, every baby in Nairobi will be named James Martin. It was so funny. So I wanted to tell those stories too.
Hmm.
The people, the other thing was I had never worked in really at any sort of length of time. I was in Jamaica in Kingston for 4 months, but this is a long time in the developing world, and this is a long time with a group of people from totally different cultures, plural, you
Hmm.
know, Somali, Ugandan, Kenyan, Rwandese, and it was really a stretch for me. And but as I said, and as I say in the book, I found so many of the traditions and the words and the ways of doing things so challenging, but also charming and really kind of beautiful. And you can see I have a smile on my face. I really enjoyed going to work every day and just hearing what we would have to kind of face and deal with, and meet these wonderful people who were, as I said, quite funny.
One of the things that also, struck me, as you know, I spent some years at the Catholic Worker a long time ago, and often people will say, oh, these people are taking advantage of you, or they're trying to get away with something, or they're conning you, or they're giving you this sob story or something like that. And occasionally you had experiences where it seemed like someone was sort of cheating, or taking more than their share, or using false pretenses for something. And on one hand, you had to kind of call that out, because if you didn't, you wouldn't be able to function. It would be unfair to the others. On the other hand, it made you think that, gosh, these are people for whom, a plastic cup is
Yeah.
a luxury, or these are people for whom they're trying to support their children, or food for their children. And what would you do in that situation, if you were that desperate?
Yeah, and it didn't bother me as much. I mean, I wouldn't say I was cheated, but maybe JRS, there was one guy who actually, this is pretty funny. So we one of the handicraft businesses was wood carving. We had a great Mozambican wood carver named Agostino who did beautiful wood carvings. But we had other people who did more simple wood carvings, animals and things like that you would find in the city market. And we found out that one guy was buying things at the city market, wood carvings, and coming and selling them to us. And the Jesuit I worked with, he's now the head of the Jesuit Refugee Service. I should also say one of the people in the book is Michael Schupf, who's now the head of JRS, which is
Oh,
kind of
wow.
25 years later. He sort of pointed that out to me, and I said, well, that's his income generating project.
All
he's
right.
he's he's making a little money. So it didn't bother me as much, but I did have to call it out. And there were some situations where people were cheating, but that was the exception. And as I quote a saint, I think it's Claudine Thévenet, the founders of the Religious of Jesus and Mary, who said, better let 10 people get away with it than let the one person who's
Yeah.
really needy, kind of suffer. So that was okay. And it didn't happen that frequently.
There was a story, early on, where someone was giving you a hard buck story about how he needed this money to get a bus or something like
Yeah.
that. And so you gave it to him. And then another person with the same story. And someone said, next time, offer to take them to the bus station yourself and buy them a ticket. And so you try that. And he sort of smiled and said, brother, you've been in Kenya for a while now, haven't you?
Well, it was funny because the second guy, I don't want to focus too much on the people who were cheating because it was a
Yeah.
small percentage, but the second guy who came in said the same thing. I'm stuck in Nairobi because my brother died and I can't get back home. And I sincerely said, wow, the same thing happened to some guy last week.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, early on I was, you learn some, it's like if you live in New York City, you learn some of the kind of common scams, but as I said, 99% of the people were hardworking and honest and really, as you said, that just that small amount of money, and we're talking like $500, maybe $1,000 for a grant, that changed their lives. I mean, they could start businesses. And we had one woman who, Gaudi Ruzaje, she was a Rwandese refugee. She started the Splendid Tailoring Shop. I love that name. And then she started a school. And there was the Splendid Tailoring Shop and school. And we gave her money for Singer sewing machines. And you would go in and there'd be, 10 women learning how to sew. So she was very creative. And that was one of the big success stories. And there are a lot of stories like that in the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a beautiful kind of travelogue in a way. I mean, you're how much you enjoyed describing all of the trees and the flowers and the smell of the air, and it's so visual and you really feel like you're there, but you also feel like you're taking a journey into the world of people so different from us, for most of us, a world most of us will never experience. And how much how that's really the enriching part of the travel and the new experience is to see a different side of life and to be in relationship with these people and what it taught you.
Yeah, and I wanted to have it be not just a series of stories, like one
Mm,
refugee after another. I wanted to have it a narrative thread, and the narrative thread is my own time there and my own journey. And so the reader follows me along my own journey and, ups and downs. And I didn't. I think I say at the beginning of the book, at the very beginning, I don't think I ever wanted to go to Africa. I wasn't against it, but a lot of people say, "Oh, I always dreamed to go to Africa." I never really thought about that. And what happened was I asked my superiors when I was getting ready to be missioned. It's a time called Regency for Jesuits. It's between first studies of philosophy and theology. We work full time for 2 or 3 years. And I went into my superior at the time and I said, well, I'm interested in Jesuit refugee service or the nativity schools, which a lot of people I'm sure know of. And he said, oh, well, definitely Jesuit refugee service because you want to be, with the international society. I mean, he said it literally like that. He no discernment. And but he'd been overseas. And he said, call Jesuit refugee service and see where they need you most. And within an hour, I called JRS in Washington and they said, Kenya. So that was that. And so I went and it really did change my life. It was tough at first. I thought, my gosh, I'm so far away from home. I don't know anything. I don't know the language. But eventually, I think by finding work that I found meaningful, and I just say, look, I've been in America for 25 years. I love writing, as you know, Robert. I've written a lot of those books that you talked about. I've written all the books you talked about. This was the best job I ever had.
mm,
My time in Kenya was not not without its difficulties, but the most rewarding job that I ever had. It was creative, it was fun. Starting that shop was fun. Working with these people from all over the world, one after another that would come in your door,
mhm.
traveling all over Nairobi, visiting their places. It was really, really enjoyable. And I'm glad I was able to put it down in a book because I think, now I don't think I remember half of the stories.
I Early on you describe how tossing out the trash, including magazines and things that you had, including one that I guess was a Jesuit yearbook or magazine that had pictures of some of your classmates or whatever, and then you found in somebody's house or dwelling had these pictures cut out and were on the
Yeah.
walls of his house, and you said, I actually these some of my friends here, and he said, man,
Yeah.
so proud to be having your friends in my house, brother.
Yeah, it was really I get moved when I hear that story. I haven't thought about it in a long time. Yeah, and there were so many times when things that I would, which I talk about giving away some plastic cups. That's a big
Yeah,
sort
that's
of
a wonderful
set
story.
piece.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you. We got a donation of, I think, 1,000 plastic cups, green
Yeah.
plastic cups. And we had a Christmas party for the refugees at the Mikono Center. This is in a slum called Kangemi in Nairobi, which actually a few years ago, Pope Francis visited. And we had this big party. We had about 250 refugees. We had served cake and Fanta. And we said, oh, we're going to give out these cups. And there was this kind of mad dash for these cups. And I realized, we're dealing with refugees and they don't get stuff every day. And they're used to being in the camps. So there was this big grab for the cups and they were pulling them apart. It was kind of crazy. Anyway, everybody got their cup. And a couple of weeks later, I was visiting one of the refugees, and these are very simple plastic mugs. I was visiting one of the refugees, and the mug was in sort of the center of her coffee table in her little shack, pride of place. And she said, I love those mugs. I love my mug. It's probably cost $1. But for her, it was a big deal. And I found that just really moving. The stuff that we think of as, cheap or throwaway. And for someone who's poor, it's just a treasure. And that was really powerful for me in a way that I really can't even explain. So I tell that story. And I also leave a lot to the reader to kind of
Hmm.
decide, to say, I just kind of tell the stories without
Right.
interpreting.
No, 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 there's not a lot of yeah, exactly as you say, you leave it to the reader.
Yeah.
I 25 years after this book came out, and we're in this moment now where we hear constantly about the invasions of refugees, illegal aliens, pouring across the border, and how terrible they are. They're murderers. They're all this kind of thing. I'm going to repeat all of that. And then on the other hand, you have Pope Francis, who has really made care for refugees, welcoming the stranger, as one of the kind of signatures of his social message. Uh, and and I think this, again, it's one thing to think, well, they're all Africans there. They all get along. It's all
Right.
part of the
Right.
same country or whatever, of
Right.
Africa,
Right.
whatever like that. And here you had like, what is like 100,000 refugees in Nairobi or something
Mhm. At the
enormous,
time, yeah.
living in slums, that sort of thing. Uh, but as you say, looking at these as people who are trying to survive, who are trying to do the best for their family and are incredibly hardworking, and are not terrorists and career criminals
Sure.
and people emptied out of insane asylums or cannibals or whatever we hear
Right.
about all this time. I think this is a book that really is very topical, and should be read. And it's not just a reality from that's in Africa, and you came back to this country where we don't deal with refugees or something like that. But I think it might challenge people to think about that in a new way.
Well, I hope so, because it really does kill me when I hear refugees and migrants talked about as animals. It's unbelievable to me. Now, I mean, we obviously need reasonable border policies and safe border policies, and there are ways of getting asylum and all that. But the idea that these people are animals, and that they're lazy, these are in Africa, these were the hardest working people I think I've ever met. They try to endure things. They're very faithful. And I always say to people, what would you do?
Mhm.
If your country was at war and your family was endangered and your life was endangered, you would go somewhere else. And where would you go? And what would you do? And how would you want people to treat you? And so one of the reasons for my telling their stories, right, and not just having it be a book about statistics, is to remind people that a person is a story. And when you learn their story, you come to know the person. There's a reason why Jesus taught in parables, right? He taught in stories. And I wanted to tell a lot of their stories, to put really faces on these, what are often kind of nameless masses of people that appear, we see people at the border and we see just crowds of people. Well, each of them have a story,
Mhm.
and they're closer to your stories than you would imagine. So it is very topical, and it does kill me when I hear that. I really find that so offensive. Animals. It's just
Berman, yeah,
awful.
poisonous.
These are human beings, and they're also, if we want to look at it from a purely kind of Catholic point of view, a lot of them are Christians and Catholics, and these are brothers and sisters in Christ too. So
Mhm.
it kills me to hear that.
Let me tell you a story that I'm not sure I shared with you before. Some years ago, I had an opportunity to go to Nairobi to give a retreat there for Maryknoll, and I went to the Mukono Center.
You did.
Yeah, and I bought some things, and there was a young African woman there who was working there, and I said, "Do you by any chance know Father Jim Martin?" And she said, "Oh, he is our founder." And I said, she said, "I never knew him." And I said, "Well, he's actually a friend of mine." And she said, "I am so proud to be having friends of Father Jim in my store."
Oh, nice. I just, you just tell me that story, and I just that was the environment over there. That is the environment over there. that's a very warm human environment, which I think actually had a lot to teach me,
Mhm.
right? And the way that they treated people, I'm talking about the Kenyans and the refugees, the way that they would want you to spend time with them. It wasn't all just rush, rush. I went to so very warm. I went to a woman's house once, or in the slum, kind of. We would go to kind of check up on their projects to see how they were doing. Did you need any help? Just to get a sense of where they were. And sometimes like solve problems, often with their landlords. But I was in one woman's house and I looked at my watch and she said, "Oh," she said, "I know you're an American, so you have to go, don't you?" And it wasn't a mean thing. She just realized that part of our culture was go, go, go on to the next thing. And I mean, obviously I had things to do. There's a balance there. I had things to do, right? But in a sense, the focus was much more on relationships and kind of our shared humanity. It wasn't always about work and getting things done. So I I learned a lot. I learned a lot from that interaction. So
Well, you say there that you didn't always have, money or things that you could give them, but just giving them your time,
yeah,
so precious because they're used to being standing in lines, being treated roughly by agencies and
absolutely. And often mistreated, at least when I was there in the 1990s, they would often be rounded up by the police, the Kenyan police, and put into jail. And so, yeah, I wanted to treat them with dignity, and they're not just numbers. And I think one of the things I'm happiest about is that they became friends.
yeah.
We laugh about things, and
Hmm.
uh, they would tease me. They
Hmm.
said to me, they said to me, one of them, in Kenya, you probably remember, like there's a lot of that red earth, kind of the almost clay, red clay, and it's everywhere. That's the ground. It's very fertile, but it was very very dirty. I mean, there was dirt all over the place and mud all over the place. And uh, we had these dogs in our Jesuit compound, and they would always jump on me with their dirty feet. And it took me a while to clean my clothes because also it was the long story where we didn't have a dryer and all this kind of stuff. So the refugees themselves were actually quite well dressed. Like they took care of their appearance as much as they could. When they came to see me, they were very well dressed. And when one of the refugees actually said to me, Brother Jim, your pants are really dirty. You should clean them. And I thought, well, at least they feel they feel open to talk with me about stuff. So they were very blunt with me about different things. Like, they would also say, funny enough, they would say, don't don't believe her.
Yeah,
The
right. Yeah,
refugee
right,
that was
right.
just in to see you. She's not very good. Believe me.
Yeah,
So
right.
I appreciated just their honesty and their bluntness and their humor too.
Well, I want to thank you very much. This experience changed your heart. I think that anyone who reads this book will feel their heart changed. And the question is, well, what do you do with that then? Where do you
Yeah.
go from there? And I hope it will lead to more. Just be the beginning of an ongoing conversion of heart.
Well, I want to say thank you for publishing it 25 years ago and for really helping out. And this is my first book. And so it's really meaningful to me. I think in many ways it's my favorite book. And because I also think I'll share something that I don't normally share. I wrote this before my other books were, quote unquote, well known. And so it's just me. There's no worry about how people are going to receive it, or I'm not sort of editing myself. It's pure. This is what I experienced, and I go back and I read it with a lot of joy. So anyway, thank you for publishing it. Thanks for your time and thanks for celebrating 25 years with me.
Absolutely. On to the next 25 years. This Our Exile, spiritual journey with the refugees of East Africa.